Living Expo, and it is my pleasure to introduce my husband, Dr. Rick Dina. My name is Dr. Karen Dina. I have to say, for the amount of time that I've known Rick, which is over 20 years now, he probably more than anybody that I've ever met has this wonderful ability to take really complex subjects and make them understandable. He's also really good at putting together information in a way that people can understand. So those are some of the great things that you can expect from him in this talk. Now, aside from that, he's been studying and practicing raw food nutrition since 1987. His experience includes working at Hippocrates Health Institute and teaching at Bastyr University. After 10 years in private practice, he is now teaching raw food nutrition full-time in various capacities, including here at the Living Light Culinary Arts Institute with me. We teach the Science of Raw Food Nutrition series and are now working on our first book as well as other educational opportunities. So here is Dr. Rick Dina.
Thank you very much. We didn't actually choose to introduce each other. That's just what the schedule said, so that's what we got to do. I introduced Karen, I think, yesterday. So it's interesting. So welcome, everybody. And, you know, it's interesting. We just finished a 3-part telecourse with Renegade Health with Kevin Gianni, where we were just basically speaking into the phone and we couldn't interact with anybody. And it was rather challenging for us to just speak into the phone and assume everybody's there. So it's really nice to be back in front of a live audience where I can see people's heads nodding and knowing that you're getting more of you are actually out there watching this streaming via the internet. So that's great for you folks, and it's nice for me that we have a live audience here. So today we're going to talk about carbohydrates, insulin, and blood sugar regulation. A topic that is of much debate and something that there's just a great deal of confusion about out there in the public. We're going to try to break some things down, cover the basics, and make this situation understandable so you're not as confused when you go out there and you can start to do the right things that are not only going to make your blood sugar and your insulin levels work properly, but a whole bunch of other things that are all going to work well together simultaneously. And I'm going to try to just get through the basic presentation briefly and have plenty of time for questions and answers. Now, how many people have ever been stuck in traffic? Okay, most of us, right? Just about everyone. And you will see here that I am not an artist, but I'm going to draw the Pacific Ocean, and I'm going to draw maybe some mountains here, and let's say we're going to say San Jose is down here, and we're going to head up the peninsula, and we're going to make some piers and all that kind of stuff. Alcatraz is out here. We're going to make roughly San Francisco. So again, as you can see, you'll have to bear with me here. I'm not an artist. And then here's the Bay. So here we have Berkeley and Oakland. Okay, so now what we've got is we're going to take a look at the Golden Gate Bridge. So here it comes. Art is my thing, as you can tell. So here we have the Golden Gate Bridge, and this is 101. Now, we're here in the North Bay. I think many people live in the North Bay, and if not, you may be heading home this way tonight or tomorrow, back down into the city or down the peninsula, and you've got to stop heading into San Francisco at the toll booth. And if there's a lot of cars, the toll booth backs up. And you can back up, the cars can back all the way up onto the bridge, and you can back up into Marin County if things are really backed up. Now, in the morning commute, there's a lot of places, whether it's San Francisco or San Jose or other cities, Los Angeles, Denver, Philadelphia, wherever the case may be, where when you go onto the on-ramp, they don't let all the cars just go onto the highway right away. They've got those meters there, right? So you wait for the red light, or you stop at the red light, and then the green light, and then you go onto the highway gradually. And the idea there is that they let all the cars go onto the highway all at once from all the on-ramps, the highway would just get too crowded and it would be too much. So they put those lights there, and that slows the rate at which the cars enter the highway from the on-ramps. So imagine that you're in traffic every day, and you go through this thing, it's your morning commute, let's say you live in San Rafael or Larkspur or someplace like that, and you've got to get down here to the financial district to do your job in the city. And every day you're backed up on the bridge, you're waiting, and it takes you twice as long to get in there as it should, and you don't spend as much time with your family, and you have to get up earlier in the morning, and you start to think, this is rather challenging. Maybe there's a better way. And you notice, when you get down to the bridge, that there's the option for about, how many lanes are there? 10 or 12 maybe? There's 10 or 12 lanes that you can go through. And you'll notice that only 3 or 4 of them are open. And you think, I wonder if they opened all those lanes, maybe there wouldn't be as much of a backup. Maybe the cars could go through more quickly. In fact, maybe they wouldn't even need those light meters on the on-ramps, because if the traffic was just constantly moving on the highway, you wouldn't have to slow down the rate at which the cars enter the highway, because everything's just moving. So you talk to some people, and you say, I was thinking that if we opened up more lanes, that could solve this whole traffic problem. And you're going to see in a minute why I'm talking about traffic when we're talking about insulin and blood sugar. And you get a call back from the head of the, I'm going to make it up, the Caltrans Bridge Board. And they're going to tell you that you didn't go to school to study and you don't have an advanced degree, and who the heck do you think you are making suggestions to us because they've studied it and that's the best way to do it. And you notice, you say to them, well, in Denver or in Cleveland or in Munich or in other places, they've opened up more lanes and the cars can get through more easily. And they say, no, that's not going to do it. We've got the meters out there on the on-ramps, and that's the way we're going to do it. And then you start to find out some other people are proposing to open up more lanes also. But then you get a lot of threatening letters and you get nasty comments from the people who make those meters. They don't want to open up more lanes on the bridge because they're making more meters and there's a whole system going of repairing them. And in fact, because there's cars backed up on the bridge all the time, they're going through constant retrofitting. So another division of a big construction company opens up, constantly retrofitting the bridge because the cars are all backed up on there, whereas if they weren't backed up on there as much, then there wouldn't be as much stress on the bridge. So they're against your idea as well. And we can see where on and on this could go. So let's translate this now. But it's stiff and rigid enough to stay in place when you let it go, to hold the wires together. Now, when we end up eating too much cholesterol and too many saturated fats, like most people in modern society are doing, that's like turning the twist tie into a coat hanger. It's too stiff and too rigid, so it makes the cell membranes too stiff and too rigid. The insulin receptor doesn't work right. Now, if we go overboard, let's just say you start consuming gallons of flaxseed oil, you're going to have too many unsaturated fats, and your cell membranes are going to become too fluid and flexible. That would be like turning the twist tie into a string. So it's real easy to put around the wire and twist around it, but when you let it go, it's going to fall out of place. So we want our cell membranes to be like a twist tie, not like a coat hanger, and not like a string. Most people's cell membranes are like coat hangers. Too much saturated fat and too much cholesterol. They're too stiff. Therefore, the insulin receptor doesn't work properly. Therefore, insulin doesn't work properly, and you end up with higher levels of blood sugar.
I don't think you're on mic anymore.
Oh. Well, I'll let the technical folks figure that out. So in terms of dietary fats...
It's going to be fixed in a minute.
Okay, good. So too many saturated fats. And most typical diets, most typical Western diets, are too high in saturated fats. They're straight and stiff and rigid. And I'm going to wait till the end of questions, and I'm going to try to finish up here and cover all the questions at the end. So most of us are eating too much of this, makes our cell membranes too stiff. Insulin doesn't work like it's supposed to, can't get its job done of squirting glucose from the blood into the cells. You end up with higher levels of glucose in the blood. And the other types of fats that are largely implicated are called trans fats. And have we all heard that trans fats are not good for us? I remember about 10 years ago in the news, they actually started talking about trans fats, and it was great. You know, maybe someday on the news we'll see things about enzymes or other things that we all know are important, but maybe the rest of the world doesn't yet. Now, a trans fat is an unsaturated fat that has been changed from its normal configuration called the cis or CIS configuration, where it's curved and fluid and flexible, into the trans form, which is stiff and rigid, more like a saturated fat. So if you think of soybean oil, and if I had a bottle of soybean oil out here, would it be liquid or solid? It'd be liquid, right? Because there's unsaturated fats in there that makes it liquid. Now, what if I rearranged some of the hydrogens making up the carbon-hydrogen chain of the fatty acids there, and I went through the process of hydrogenation, and I turned the soybean oil into soybean margarine, meaning I formed trans fats, and I put that soy margarine here on the table. Would that be more liquid or more solid? It would be more solid. So just by changing the form of fat from its naturally occurring form into a trans fat, we're making it more stiff. So trans fats and saturated fats, which most people are eating way too many of, and even the most conservative nutrition organizations, by the way, tell us that any level of trans fats are not good for us. So anytime you read a junk food label and you see partially hydrogenated corn, cottonseed, or soybean oil, those are the most common types of oil, that's not good for us at all, besides the fact that those oils are high in pro-inflammatory omega-6 fats, and that's a whole other story as well. So there are various nutrition programs, like the Pritikin programs I mentioned, for example. Well, they put people on a much lower fat diet. Diet has adequate amounts of unsaturated fats, doesn't include any trans fats, and it's rather low in saturated fats. They have the people get some exercise. They have them eat a diet that is low in calorie density, meaning it's full of water and fiber and low in fat. Therefore, it takes a lot of food to get not that many calories. So you can fill yourself up and feel full and satisfied without too many calories. So between doing that and getting some exercise, people also lose weight. And in that case, what happens, and by the way, that Pritikin diet is a high carbohydrate diet. About 80% of the calories come from carbohydrates, 10% from protein, and 10% from fat. Now, traditional folklore out there in our culture would tell us if you took people with diabetes who were overweight and you put them on this high carb diet, they're going to get worse and they're going to gain weight, right? Because carbs make you fat. But the fact is, when people go on the Pritikin program, they lose weight, their blood sugar comes down, and they're able to get off of their medication and off of their insulin in the great majority of cases. So the good news is there, they opened up all the lanes. Even though some of the cars from the on-ramp are still coming on to 101 rather quickly in some of the cases, because all the lanes are open, you're not going to get a backup and the glucose is going to come right into the cells. Now, people might ask, well, what about fruit? Isn't that bad? Because that's a high carbohydrate thing, and doesn't that cause your blood sugar to spike? Well, let's go back to the traffic analogy. If you've only got 2 or 3 lanes open on the Golden Gate Bridge, and you don't have any meters for the on-ramps, and all the cars are just flooding onto 101, you're absolutely going to get a backup here. So taking the meters away, you could maybe say is like fruit. And I'm really way oversimplifying things here, but that's a pretty good basic start here. Now, if all these lanes are open, and you don't have any meters on the on-ramps, and all the cars are coming in, there's not going to be a backup on the Golden Gate Bridge. So if someone's trying to recover from diabetes, fruit is not something you want to make a staple in your diet at that point. Maybe use a little bit of fruit to supply some calories without adding these unhealthy fats, but eat a lot of lettuce or celery or cucumber or high water content greens along with it to dilute out the simple carbohydrates, and focus on vegetables and focus on some grains and some beans, whether they're steamed or cooked. Either of those work really well for people overcoming diabetes. And then as you overcome the insulin resistance, which can just take a matter of weeks, then you can start to add more fruit back into your diet. So that's the good news with fruit. Now, people also oftentimes, especially in the raw food community, say, well, what about Dr. Cousin's book? There is a cure for diabetes. He got people better from diabetes. on a higher fat diet, a raw but higher fat diet. Well, that is true. Now, the first part of his program is a green juice fast. And in fact, I spent 4 years at a water fasting center where we saw people overcome insulin resistance routinely and consistently. And after the fast, their blood sugar level was much lower eating the same food compared to before the fast. The benefit there is not because the glycemic index of water is 0. It's because the fast helped clear a lot of this excess, unhealthy, stiff, rigid fat out of their cell membranes. So after the fast, insulin worked better, and therefore the same foods wouldn't make their blood sugar go up anymore. So on Dr. Cousins' program, he put people on a green juice fast, which there's not many calories in green vegetables. On the whole spectrum of eating versus fasting, he was very close to the water fasting end of the spectrum. And then afterwards, put people on a diet of not much fruit, but of any fruit at all, low glycemic index fruits. And it was higher in fat because if you're not eating fruit and you're all raw, you just can't get enough calories from vegetables. It just can't happen. So you're going to end up eating more fat. But with both of those types of programs, I would say with a Pritikin cooked program, with a higher fruit raw program, or a higher fat raw program, you're decreasing the calorie density of the diet. You're getting rid of the worst fat offenders in the diet. Hopefully you're getting some activity, and with low calorie density, people are losing weight. So no matter how you slice it in there, people are going in the right direction, and that's a good thing. So people ask how much fruit or how much fat. My basic advice to everyone is it doesn't have to be one extreme or the other. There's lots and lots of middle ground. So don't eat 5 avocados a day. I think that's excessive. Don't become a fruitarian and eat dates and other dried fruit all day. That's excessive too. A reasonable amount of fruit, meaning like 1 or 2 meals of fruit per day, and a reasonable amount of fat, maybe an avocado and a handful of nuts and seeds a day if you're not eating other calorie-dense foods. That's all perfectly reasonable. There's plenty of middle ground to work for people in there. But anything that helps overcome this insulin resistance, that's the name of the game. So before we go on, does that make sense to everyone that this is the name of the game? And the glycemic index is all about, it's just the rate at which carbohydrates enter the bloodstream. And if you're insulin resistant, then the glycemic index is a big deal. But the thing is, because it's not that hard to overcome the insulin resistance, once you do, the glycemic index is, I wouldn't say completely obsolete, but has far less importance than it does when you're insulin resistant. And I want to mention one other thing, and then we're going to open up to questions. Now, the glycemic index, again, that is the rate at which carbohydrates enter the bloodstream. So in doing studies to determine the glycemic index, what they do is they take a population of typical people, most of whom are insulin resistant, because in terms of aging and longevity, insulin resistance, of the 300 various biomarkers of aging that researchers look at to determine one's biological age, insulin resistance is the first out of that 300 to start to show up. So if your insulin levels start to go up a little bit as a result of insulin resistance, that tells you you're in the early stages of some other things coming afterwards that aren't so good, like cardiovascular disease and diabetes and other things you don't want. So in any case, they take a whole group of people, many of whom are insulin resistant, and then they give them white bread or potatoes or candy or beans or all the different things, and they measure out a glucose response after those foods, and then they average everyone together and they come up with a number. And that number is the glycemic index of that food. What they find, though, is interesting. Let's say there's 50 people in the group, and they notice that when they gave the people potatoes, Bob's glucose curve was a lot higher than Mary's. So we're like, wow, so you know what the deal is there? Bob was more insulin resistant than Mary, so he had a higher glucose score than Mary. And what they find then is that when they feed them candy bars, they find, you know what? Bob's glucose score was higher than Mary's. And then when they feed them cheese, we'll say the same thing. Bob's glucose score was higher than Mary's. So in other words, saying that the glycemic index of something is X and saying that that's exactly how it's going to happen in every single individual is really incorrect. Now, if you're in the middle of the bell curve and you're the average person and you're overweight and you're insulin resistant, you may fall within that norm. But I'm here to tell you, you don't want to fall into the norm. There's the norm and there's normal. And often normal, healthy physiology is totally different than the norm in the middle of the bell curve. So in any ways, my point about the glycemic index is depending on the degree to which your cells are either resistant to insulin or sensitive to insulin, you may have a totally different glycemic index for a particular food than somebody else does. So the thing is, by overcoming the insulin resistance, you lower your glycemic index for every food that you might consider putting into your mouth. So that's what it's all about. So we want to eat lots of fruits and vegetables. A moderate amount of avocados and nuts and seeds is not unreasonable. By doing that and eating foods that are low in calorie density that fill us up, we're going to not be as overweight. And getting rid of adipose tissue helps overcome insulin resistance. And we want to get some exercise to overcome insulin resistance and for so many other reasons. So hopefully that helps clear some things up here. And I'm going to go ahead and open up to questions now. I think, filmers, we have like 10 or 15 minutes left for questions. So, yes, sir.
Does coconut oil, is it just like all the other saturated fats? Or?
Coconut oil, that's a great question. So the coconut oil question is a really good one. Not going to turn you all into biochemists here, but a fatty acid molecule is a central chain of carbons. So these C's here are carbons. The dashes are that the carbons are each sharing an electron together and bringing those electrons together to make a bond, and that's what's keeping the carbons together. Then the carbons still have some extra electrons that it wants to share with other things, and hydrogen comes along and says, hey, we'd like to share an electron with you. So this is the basic formation of a fat, a carbon chain and hydrogens. Now down at this end, we have a little different configuration. We've got this group here called a carboxyl or an acid group. So that's a double bond to an oxygen, and then we've got an OH group here. Now, so this is the fat part. So we've got fatty, and then this is the acid part. So that's how they get the name fatty acid. Now, this acid part, we think of, pouring acid on our skin or something, and then not being a good thing. The acid group is very, very reactive. So, for example, vinegar or acetic acid is a 2-carbon saturated fat. And that's pretty intense stuff. Formic acid, which is in a bee sting or an ant bite, that's a 1-carbon saturated fat. So that's like just the acid group. Now, the typical fat in animal foods called stearic acid is an 18-carbon chain saturated fat. And when you've got a saturated fat, that means every place that you can put a hydrogen on the carbon chain, there is a hydrogen. In other words, the carbon chain is saturated with hydrogens. And when in this configuration, all the electrons are accounted for, and this is stiff and straight and non-reactive and inert. So when you've got 18 carbons of stiff, straight, inert, and non-reactive, and one section of acid, the overall reactivity of that molecule is very low. Now, in the case of coconut oil, the most common saturated fat in coconut oil is called lauric acid. And instead of 18 carbons, like you'd find in a saturated animal fat, lauric acid has 12 carbons. So 18 goes into 12. So now the non-reactive part is only 2/3 as much as it was before. So the reactive part is a higher percentage of the overall molecule. So therefore, coconut oil is easier for your body to deal with than the longer chain saturated animal fats. So that's definitely a step in the right direction. So people are, getting rid of meat and then maybe making some gourmet health foods with coconut oil in a cheesecake or something.
So it does less insulin resistance?
That's correct, because it's easier for your body to deal with and it's not as long and not as stiff. And think about a coconut oil, the total amount of fats in there, the melting point 76 degrees. room temperature. So in this room, it would probably be melting. Although lauric acid itself, which is the most abundant fat in coconut oil, its melting point is about 113 degrees. So it's 5 minutes. So it's actually still solid in the body. So you don't want to go overboard on that. Now, coconut oil, above about a tablespoon a day, can still raise your cholesterol. Still a saturated fat. You don't want to go overboard on it, but it's a big step in the right direction compared to the longer chain saturated fat. So I don't see it as a health food, but I wouldn't worry about using coconut oil here and there. And fresh young coconuts, boy, you'd have to eat cases of those to get 1 jar of coconut oil. There's a lot of water in there, so enjoy your coconuts. Okay, yes, ma'am.
What's the best way to mix food?
The best way to mix food when you eat in terms of blood sugar regulation? Well, what I would say is you want to, at just about every meal, you want to eat some green vegetables. Especially if you're eating a fruit meal, you want to eat a lot of green vegetables to help not have too many simple carbohydrates concentrated all in one place. So if someone is going to eat some, say, potatoes or rice or dehydrated crackers or something like that for dinner, if they have a big salad along with it, again, the salad's going to help dilute out the carbohydrates, so to speak, and it's also going to decrease the calorie density of the meal, and therefore people are going to not gain weight that way. So is that what you meant about mixing foods?
For digestion.
Well, that's a little separate issue than blood sugar. In terms of blood sugar regulation, eat lots of low-calorie density, high-water, high-fiber content foods. Lots of focus on vegetables and have a moderate amount of fruit. And by moderate, I don't mean like 1 or 2 things a day. I mean, you can sit down and eat 10 plums and a couple pieces of lettuce. That's a good meal. Don't do that all day. Do it like maybe once a day, and that's good. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Do you have recommendations about how diabetics should drink green smoothies?
Okay, so how should diabetic drink green smoothies? You know, someone just asked me the question, does insoluble fiber, which is one of its jobs is to regulate the introduction of carbohydrates into the bloodstream, does that remain intact when you blend food? And I found a few articles, and they basically said yes. So in other words, if you blend that food up in a blender, you're not increasing the glycemic index of it. So that's good news there. So in a green smoothie, so if someone is still insulin resistant and they're recovering from diabetes, I wouldn't recommend just, all fruit and fruit juices and 1 leaf of kale. You want to maybe use coconut as the basis. There's some simple carbohydrates in the coconut water, but there's also, a little bit of fat, which is, a little bit. Don't worry, don't pour coconut oil straight in there. And you want to put as many greens in there as the person can handle. So as green as possible. And then again, as they overcome the insulin resistance, they can actually add a little bit more fruit and make it a little bit sweeter because their body will be able to handle it at that time. So yes, ma'am, over here.
Think about chia and fruit.
Chia and fruit, as in chia seeds. Well, hydrated chia seeds. I think chia seeds are actually pretty cool. I've eaten, several people have made recipes like a chia pudding type of thing. Chia is kind of mucilaginous, and it's good for a porridge type of situation. Chia seeds are a good source of omega-3 essential fats, which actually help that insulin receptor work properly. That's like one of the few examples of a fat that's beneficial. And the good news is, from eating a diet high in fruits and vegetables, we're going to get enough of that anyway. But chia seeds adds an extra source of omega-3 fats, which is good. And some people would debate the fat in the chia seeds would interfere with insulin in getting the sugars from the fruit into the. I'm not sure that I totally agree with that at a particular meal. The science on it is limited. However, I think overall it's pretty good because it's. By adding chia seeds and not as much fruit, you're diluting the fruit again, and that's good. And did you have a question, David?
I just wonder if there's a good way to how they measure insulin resistance.
How they measure insulin resistance? Well, first of all, they can measure insulin in your bloodstream directly. So generally speaking, the higher level of insulin in your bloodstream, the more insulin resistance your body is experiencing. Because when the cells are resistant to insulin, like I said, when the cells had insulin resistance and the glucose couldn't get in, your body will make extra insulin in order to overcome the cell's insulin resistance. So for example, if your insulin level is low and your blood sugar level is low,
It's a sort of a ratio of blood sugar to.
well, that's part of it. I mean, so just for example, if both of those are low, you know your cells are sensitive to insulin because insulin is getting the job done, keeping your glucose low. If your insulin's low but your blood sugar is really high, well, that's not good. That probably means you have type 1 diabetes. Your body is making not enough insulin to get the job done. So, but in general, the insulin level itself is a pretty good indicator. High levels of insulin, insulin resistance. Low levels of insulin, you're not insulin resistant. Okay, yes, and I'll just try to keep going until they, I think we're still pretty good on time. No, the other guy went later and started low. I'm just going to answer one more question informally, maybe off the camera, but we'll make sure we clear out. And is there anyone right after me in this room? There is. Okay, so we'll make sure we clear out in plenty of time to not inhibit anyone else's presentation because I really want to
Rick, if
do
you
that.
don't mind, or if the audience doesn't mind, it really helps me if I can set up while you're talking.
Absolutely, please.
Thank you.
Please. Oh, you're the next member, so yes, don't let me interfere.
I have all
Why
the
don't you just-
instruments.
Why don't you just come right up the center here? I think there's plenty of room for you.
I'll be moving if you don't.
Yes, ma'am, your question.
Ask questions. Well, I was just going to say, I'm a living example of what you talked about. About a year and a half ago, I had a physical blood test. I fit all those categories: high insulin, high blood glucose, totally inactive. I was obese, high cholesterol, consuming a SAD diet. And I went on a complete overhaul program, lost 65 pounds, became very active, exercise, did all my blood tests again, everything was normal.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. And it's an attestament to how all this stuff can change so quickly. So often people say you have diabetes, you're going to have it for the rest of your life. Now you got to get on the low glycemic diet, you got to manage your medications and your insulin. Eventually we'll probably have to increase your insulin, and then you're going to have blindness and kidney problems and bad circulation, or we're going to cut your toes off. And the thing is, more people did what you did, well then unfortunately the physical therapy and the rehab and the amputation people, they're like the people retrofitting the bridge and making the meters. They won't be as happy, but we'll all be healthier. So beautiful. Thank you very much for sharing that. All right, and we're good. So what I'm going to do is head outside, and if anyone wants to ask me questions, I'll be more than happy to keep answering them. And thank you there in Internet land.